My son showed up and said, "My wife, the kids, and her mother will live here. They're cramped in the apartment. Everything is already arranged." And he left full of confidence to go get them. But when they came back, what they saw left everyone speechless. Margaret had lived in her modest two-bedroom apartment in Tampa, Florida, for over 15 years. Retired from her job as a school librarian, her days followed a simple, comforting routine. She brewed her coffee at 7 o'clock in the morning sharp, fed her tabby cat, Juniper, and read the newspaper at the small kitchen table by the window. The television murmured old reruns in the background while the sun spilled over her potted succulents. It was a quiet life, and she liked it that way. So when a knock came to the door that Friday afternoon, Margaret wasn't expecting anyone. She paused, her hands still damp from washing dishes, and frowned. She dried them on her apron and walked to the door. Standing there, grinning like he used to when he wanted to borrow the car in high school, was Brian, her only son. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping forward without waiting for an invitation. "Got a minute?" Margaret blinked, caught between surprise and curiosity. Brian rarely visited without calling first. He lived across town with his wife and their 2 kids. The last time she had seen him was during Christmas, nearly 5 months ago. "You're early for Thanksgiving," she joked, stepping aside so he could come in. Brian gave her a quick hug and looked around as if seeing the place for the first time. "Place looks the same," he said, scratching the back of his neck. Margaret studied him closely. His eyes were a bit tired, his shoulders more hunched than usual. Something was off. "I need to tell you something," he said, not meeting her gaze. "Amanda and I, well, we're in a bit of a tight spot. The lease on our place is up, and her mom's staying with us now. And with the kids, it's just too much." Margaret's brow furrowed. "You need help with rent?" He shook his head. "No. I mean, yes, but that's not why I'm here. We're moving in with you, just for a while." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. "You're what?" "Just for a bit. A few weeks, tops. Amanda, the kids, her mom. We already packed up the car. They're waiting outside." Margaret opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She tried to process what he was saying. Her quiet home, her sanctuary, suddenly sounded like it was about to turn into a crowded motel. "You didn't think to ask me first?" "I knew you'd say no," Brian said quickly. "But we really don't have a choice, Mom. Please understand." Without waiting for her response, he gave her a quick kiss on the cheek and turned toward the door. "I'll go get them." And then he was gone. Margaret stood frozen, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Juniper hopped onto the counter and meowed, but Margaret didn't move. She stared at the door, her heart pounding. In all her years of motherhood, she had faced storms, divorces, job losses, Brian's teenage rebellion, but nothing like this. She walked to the small guest room and opened the door. It held a narrow bed, an old dresser, and some photo albums she hadn't opened in years. No space for 4 more people. Back in the living room, she sat down on the edge of the sofa. The cushion sank beneath her, and suddenly the apartment, which had always felt just right, seemed too small, too fragile, not built to hold this kind of intrusion. Outside, she heard car doors slamming. It was beginning. The door opened again before Margaret could even stand. Brian led the way in, hauling 2 bulky duffel bags over his shoulder, followed by Amanda, who balanced a large box on her hip while guiding the children through the doorway. Behind them came an older woman in a stiff beige coat, despite the Florida heat, her lips pressed into a firm line as she surveyed the apartment with the scrutiny of a customs officer inspecting contraband. Mrs. Jenkins. No one asked where to put things. They simply moved. The children, Caleb and Ellie, dashed past Margaret without so much as a hello, their small sneakers thumping against the wood laminate floor as they disappeared into the back of the apartment. Amanda smiled barely and set the box down beside the couch. "Hi, Margaret," she said, as if they were meeting at a casual brunch and not walking uninvited into someone else's home. Mrs. Jenkins didn't speak at all. She paused in the middle of the living room, scanned the modest furnishings, and made a barely audible humph. Her gaze lingered on the lace curtains Margaret had sewn herself 3 summers ago. She said nothing, but the expression on her face said everything. Margaret opened her mouth, not even sure what she intended to say, but Amanda was already in motion, directing Brian to bring in the second load from the car. Boxes appeared like magic, stacked in corners, dropped at the edge of the hallway, squeezed against a bookshelf in the living room. Within 10 minutes, the small apartment looked like a storage unit mid-move. "Where do you want the kids to sleep?" Amanda asked, brushing her hands on her jeans. Margaret blinked. "There's only the one guest room. We figured Mrs. Jenkins could take that, and we'll use the living room. Kids can have sleeping bags. It'll work, I promise." Amanda didn't wait for an answer. She was already halfway down the hall, calling out, "Come on, kids, help me unpack." Margaret remained near the front door, unable to move, unable to speak. Mrs. Jenkins walked past her, trailing a faint scent of lavender and disapproval, and entered the guest room with a sigh. "Small, but I suppose we'll have to do," she murmured. Brian returned moments later with another round of bags, his shirt damp with sweat. "Could you grab some towels, Mom? The kids need to wash up. We were on the road a while." Margaret turned toward the hallway mechanically, her mind blank. Towels, soap, washcloths. These small requests felt like pebbles piling up on her chest. By the time dinner rolled around, no one had mentioned food. Margaret stood in the kitchen, reheating a frozen lasagna meant to last through the week. She hadn't asked if they wanted any. They just assumed. Amanda took over plating the food before Margaret could offer, pulling forks from the drawer and glasses in the cabinet as if she'd done it 100 times. Brian sat at the table with Caleb on his lap, scrolling through his phone. Ellie climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs and asked loudly, "Do you have any juice?" "Mommy says soda's bad." "We don't drink soda," Mrs. Jenkins added from across the room, not looking up from the armchair where she had settled with a knitting project. Margaret nodded slowly. "There's apple juice in the fridge." The meal passed in a blur. The children talked over each other. Amanda mentioned needing space in the pantry for the kids' snacks. Mrs. Jenkins commented that the sofa cushions felt thin. Brian didn't notice when Ellie spilled water on the rug. When the last dish was cleared, Amanda rinsed a few plates and left the rest in the sink. By the time Margaret sat down again, the apartment no longer felt like hers. Later that night, Margaret stood in the hallway with her hand resting on the doorframe of her bedroom. The light was off in the living room, but she could hear Amanda's voice softly scolding Caleb for kicking off his blanket. A dull glow leaked under the door of the guest room where Mrs. Jenkins had barricaded herself. The kitchen was still cluttered from dinner. The bathroom smelled like bubblegum toothpaste. She went to her bedroom and closed the door without turning on the light. The silence on her side of the wall was hollow. Juniper jumped onto the bed, curling up beside her like always, but even her soft purring couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably. In the morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of cartoons. Ellie was laughing, and the television volume had clearly been set for the benefit of the entire neighborhood. Amanda was talking loudly on a video call in the kitchen. The smell of scrambled eggs and toast filled the apartment, but not from Margaret's stove. Someone had used her frying pan and left it on the counter, greasy and still warm. When she entered the room, Amanda turned to her briefly. "Hope you don't mind. The kids were starving." Margaret nodded stiffly, reaching past her daughter-in-law to grab a coffee mug from the cabinet. "Mom!" Brian called out as he emerged from the bathroom, dressed for work, adjusting his tie. "Thanks again for letting us stay. Just until we figure things out. Okay?" Before she could answer, he kissed her cheek and was gone. It wasn't that Margaret didn't love her family. Of course she did, but love didn't mean surrender. And something about this invasion, because that's what was, felt less like a favor and more like an occupation. Amanda had rearranged the living room furniture for better flow. The kids' shoes were piled near the front door. Mrs. Jenkins had asked where she kept the vacuum, but not to help, only to criticize the carpets. Every hour that passed, Margaret felt the walls inching closer, the space shrinking around her. Juniper scratched at the back door, something she rarely did. Margaret opened it and let the cat out into the screened-in patio. The morning air was already thick with humidity. She stood there for a long time, one hand on the doorframe, the other wrapped around her mug. Inside, laughter and noise filled her home. Only it didn't feel like hers anymore. And she hadn't even been asked. Margaret had never known how long a single day could feel until she started sharing her apartment with 5 other people. The once comfortable silence she had cherished had vanished, replaced by constant footsteps, bursts of children's laughter, the clang of kitchenware, and Amanda's ever-present voice discussing bills, schedules, and what she called organizing chaos. But beneath all that surface noise, another kind of silence had begun to take root, one far more suffocating. It started subtly. One morning, Margaret opened the drawer to grab her favorite teaspoon only to find it missing, replaced by a mismatched set of bright plastic utensils. She checked the drying rack, the dishwasher, even the trash, but it was gone. She didn't mention it. The next day, her stack of old cookbooks disappeared from the kitchen shelf. In their place stood cereal boxes, snack bins, and a set of labeled glass jars. She found the cookbooks later in a cardboard box, shoved into the bottom of her bedroom closet. Amanda never asked before changing something. She moved through the apartment with the assurance of someone who had decided the space was hers to manage. Once, Margaret came into the living room and found Amanda rearranging the photo frames on the wall. The pictures of Margaret's late husband and their younger years were shifted to a lower corner. In their place, Amanda pinned a corkboard with color-coded sticky notes for chores and meal planning. "I thought this might help keep everyone on the same page," she said, tapping the board. "We just need structure." Margaret looked at the board, then at the tilted picture of her husband half buried behind it, and said nothing. Mrs. Jenkins, meanwhile, had taken to commenting on nearly every detail of the apartment. She disapproved of the lighting in the hallway, said the bathroom sink drained too slowly, and once asked if Margaret had ever considered repainting the walls a more cheerful color. "I suppose when you live alone for too long, you stop noticing how dull things become," she said one evening, sipping herbal tea on the armchair Margaret used to read in. "I like the color," Margaret replied softly. The older woman raised her eyebrows. "Of course, everyone's entitled to their preferences." The children, oblivious to the adult tension, treated the apartment as their new playground. Ellie once emptied an entire jar of flour onto the kitchen floor, pretending to make snow. Caleb discovered the joy of hiding behind the shower curtain and scaring his sister, a game that ended with a broken towel rack. Margaret tried to set boundaries. No running indoors, no toys on the stairs, no yelling after bedtime. But Amanda always countered with a light-hearted dismissal. "They're just kids, Margaret. Let them be." Brian, when he was home, acted as if everything was going smoothly. He laughed with the kids, thanked Margaret vaguely for her patience, and brushed off any attempt she made to express concern. "It's only temporary, Mom. We're figuring things out. Just give it a little more time." But time wasn't the issue. It was the way her home had stopped being hers, one piece at a time. The silence between her and her son had grown, filled with avoidance and empty reassurances. He left early in the morning, returned late in the evening, and rarely sat with her unless prompted. One afternoon, she tried again. Brian was at the kitchen table, eating a sandwich, earbuds in, scrolling through emails on his phone. Margaret sat across from him. "Brian, can we talk?" He looked up, removing one earbud. "Yeah, what's up?" "I need to understand. How long do you really think this will last?" He exhaled, chewing slowly, then shrugged. "A few weeks, maybe a couple of months. Amanda's looking into other places. We're trying, okay? But this wasn't a conversation. You showed up and moved in. You didn't ask." Brian frowned, put down the sandwich. "I told you. We had no choice." "There's always a choice," Margaret said, her voice low. "You could have talked to me." He leaned back in his chair. "Would it have changed anything?" Margaret stood, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes, it would have given me the dignity of deciding." Brian looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time in days. His face softened, but only for a moment. "Look, I know it's not ideal, but it's not forever. Just hang in there." He replaced the earbud and went back to his phone. That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above her bed. The ticking of the wall clock had never sounded so loud. She thought about her garden club meetings she hadn't attended, her quiet afternoons with her books, the weekend walks to the farmer's market. All gone, replaced by noise, clutter, and a growing feeling of invisibility. She had given birth to Brian, raised him alone after her husband passed, worked late shifts and skipped vacations to send him to college. And now he couldn't hear her, couldn't see that she was drowning in her own home. She got out of bed and walked quietly to the living room. The children were asleep on makeshift bedding near the couch. Amanda was curled under a blanket, her laptop open beside her. Mrs. Jenkins's door was closed. Margaret stood there for a long time, taking the sight of her living room turn hostile, and the feeling settled in her chest like a stone. Something had to change. The plan had not come to Margaret all at once. It emerged slowly, like morning fog lifting from a field, revealing small, familiar things she had almost forgotten. The taste of freedom, the comfort of boundaries, the right to say no. Her silence had protected her dignity until now, but it was no longer enough. It was not anger that pushed her toward a decision. It was clarity. If she wanted peace again, she would have to go and find it herself. It was on a Tuesday afternoon when the house was finally empty. Brian at work, Amanda running errands with the children, and Mrs. Jenkins attending what she called a social gathering for respectable women at a local senior center. That Margaret opened the hallway closet and pulled out her old suitcase. She placed it on her bed and unzipped it with care, as though unsealing a future she had long delayed. There was no rush in her hands, no tremor, only precision. She began packing what she knew she needed and nothing more. Her favorite sweater, a framed photograph of her late husband, her reading glasses, 3 paperbacks she had read many times but still loved. She folded each item gently, placing them as if composing a small altar to her next chapter. She didn't pack for travel. She packed for staying gone. The bedroom closet, where she had once stored clothes by season, became a shelf itself in under an hour. She took only what she wore often and left the rest in place. She passed over the knickknacks on the dresser, taking only the porcelain hummingbird figurine that had belonged to her mother. Everything else, the jewelry she no longer wore, the scarf Amanda had once called dated, the perfume she never sprayed anymore, remained behind, not out of neglect, but out of purpose. This was not a retreat. It was an intentional departure. When she reached the guest room, she hesitated only briefly. The door was ajar. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air. Mrs. Jenkins had left a shawl draped neatly over the bedpost. Margaret stepped in quietly, opened the bottom drawer of the old dresser, and retrieved a sealed envelope she had kept there for years, a letter she had written to herself after retiring. It wasn't meant to be found by others, and she didn't plan to leave it behind. She slipped it into the side pocket of her suitcase and returned to the hallway without looking back. In the living room, everything was still in its new arrangement. The corkboard with reminders, the toy bin by the TV, the folded blankets and stacked shoes. She moved slowly, almost reverently, gathering what little she would carry. Her purse, a set of keys, a small leather-bound journal. By the time the sun had begun its slow descent behind the apartment buildings, Margaret had completed everything. She vacuumed the hallway, wiped down the kitchen counters, sorted the mail, and set the table for dinner with placemats and clean dishes. It was not spite that moved her, but the desire to leave the house in order, to part without resentment, without bitterness. She did not want her absence to be a storm. She wanted it to be unmistakable but calm, like a light being turned off in a room after everyone is gone. When Brian came home, he found her waiting for him on the patio. The children had not yet returned, and Amanda and Mrs. Jenkins were still out. He looked surprised to see her sitting there with a cup of tea, dressed in the same light cardigan she always wore for serious conversations. "You look thoughtful," he said, setting his bag down by the door. "I am," she replied. "Come, sit for a minute." He joined her, sensing something unusual in her voice. She offered him a cup of tea, and for a moment, it felt like old times, a quiet pause between the noise of life. But that illusion did not last. "I wanted to talk to you before the others came back," she said evenly. Brian nodded slowly. "Okay, What's going on? Margaret didn't preface it with excuses or emotional buildup. Her voice was calm and clear. You and your family can stay here as long as you need to, but I won't be staying with you. He stared at her. What? I found a new place. A smaller home, quieter, with a few neighbors closer to my age. Somewhere I can rest and think again. I've already packed. Brian sat back, stunned. You're leaving your own apartment? Mom, come on. That doesn't make any sense. It makes perfect sense, she said, her voice still composed. This place hasn't been mine since you arrived. You took over without asking. I let it happen, but I don't have to keep letting it happen. But we thought this was temporary, he said, visibly rattled. You said you'd be okay. No, you told yourself I'd be okay, she corrected gently. I stayed quiet to give you time, not permission. Brian looked away, jaw clenched. Where will you go? A place where I can be myself again, she said. Somewhere I'm not a background character in my own life. He was quiet for a long moment. Amanda's not going to understand this. I'm not asking for her understanding, Margaret replied. I'm telling you what I need. When Amanda and the children returned, they found Brian pacing outside while Margaret finished folding a clean dish towel in the kitchen. Amanda's expression turned from confusion to alarm. What's going on? She asked. Brian said you're leaving? Margaret didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply said, the apartment is yours for now. Please take care of it. I'll be gone by morning. Amanda opened her mouth, clearly ready to object, but something in Margaret's gaze stopped her. Later that night, when the children were asleep and the television was off, Margaret sat alone in her bedroom. The bags were packed. The window was open slightly, letting in the warm Florida air. For the first time in weeks, she felt peace return. Not fully, not permanently, but like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. She did not write a note that night. That would come in the morning, along with the last cup of coffee she would ever brew in that kitchen. But already, Margaret knew she had reclaimed something that no one else had the right to take. Her place in the world. When morning arrived, the apartment held the careful stillness of an empty church. Quiet, ordered, and somehow heavier for its tidiness. Sunlight filtered through freshly cleaned windows, illuminating spotless surfaces, carefully arranged furniture, and polished floors that bore no trace of Margaret's silent departure. Brian awoke first, sensing immediately that something had shifted profoundly overnight. The familiar hum of morning sounds, the kettle whistling, the faint clink of Margaret's teaspoon in her coffee mug, was conspicuously absent. Brian stepped out of the bedroom slowly, taking in the unsettling neatness of the apartment. He noticed how the kitchen counters were clear, dishes neatly stacked in cabinets, chairs carefully aligned around the table, and the living room cushions fluffed and arranged. The scent of cleaning products lingered in the air, as if someone had deliberately erased every evidence of a life lived here. Amanda emerged behind him, a confused frown creasing her forehead. Ellie and Caleb shuffled sleepily behind her, rubbing their eyes, unaware yet that something had changed. Mrs. Jenkins appeared last, pulling a robe tightly around her shoulders, already wearing an expression of skepticism. It was Ellie who first noticed the envelope, placed precisely in the center of the dining room table. She tugged Amanda's sleeve and pointed silently. Amanda's eyes widened, and without speaking, she crossed the room quickly, retrieving the note and unfolding it slowly. Brian watched her closely, every muscle in his body tensing, as Amanda's eyes scanned Margaret's careful handwriting. When she finally looked up, her face was pale, her lips parted slightly, searching for words that wouldn't come. "She's gone," Amanda whispered, the note trembling slightly in her hand. "What does it say?" Brian asked quietly, dread deepening in his chest. Amanda handed the note to him, unable to explain. Brian took it and read silently, Margaret's words clear and firm. "Dear family, by now, you've noticed that I am no longer here. This is not an abandonment, nor is it an act of anger or resentment. It is simply my way of reclaiming myself and the dignity I felt slipping away day by day. I loved having a family again, but that love cannot thrive without boundaries. My home was taken from me without permission, and rather than fighting to keep a place that had become unfamiliar, I have chosen peace instead. I've found a small home in a community with people my age, where I can regain the quiet independence I've earned. I'm safe and I'm comfortable. Please do not worry or search for me. This decision was difficult, but necessary. Take care of each other, and please remember that every home, no matter how small, deserves respect and consideration. With love, Margaret. Brian stood motionless, his hands gripping the letter so tightly that the paper crumpled slightly at the edges. For the first time, he grasped fully the depth of his mother's pain, felt acutely the weight of his own negligence. Amanda's eyes filled with quiet tears, not for herself, but for a realization that had come too late. The children, sensing tension, clung to her side, uncertain and silent, sensing the magnitude of what they didn't yet fully understand. Mrs. Jenkins moved to sit in Margaret's armchair, her lips pressed tightly together, as though she'd finally glimpsed a reflection she didn't want to see. Her sharp criticisms dissolved into silence as the realization settled around her that she too had crossed a boundary. She stared at her hands, folded neatly in her lap, humbled by a sudden clarity about how little she had respected the woman whose home she'd entered uninvited. The apartment became quiet, the silence a thick, tangible presence filling the spaces Margaret had left behind. No one knew exactly what to say, and in that absence of speech, something powerful emerged, the shared understanding of what they had done. The realization was overwhelming in its simplicity, undeniable and painfully clear. Brian folded the letter carefully, placing it back on the table. He felt an impulse to apologize, to chase after his mother, to undo the careless invasion that had brought them here. But instinctively, he understood it was too late. Margaret had given him everything he needed to know, not through anger or accusation, but through the quiet resolve of her absence. Amanda finally spoke, her voice gentle and cautious. Maybe we needed this. Maybe this is exactly how it had to happen. Brian nodded slowly, a heavy sigh escaping him. She deserved better than this. The day unfolded quietly, each member of the family withdrawn into thoughtful silence. The children watched cartoons without laughing. Amanda moved around the kitchen with unusual hesitation, uncertain of her place without Margaret's quiet authority. Mrs. Jenkins remained in the armchair, knitting needles forgotten, her proud demeanor softened into quiet reflection. Brian stood by the window for a long time, staring out at the sunny Tampa Street, feeling keenly the loss of something he had mistakenly assumed was guaranteed. His mother's presence, her silent strength, her unwavering patience. Margaret's absence lingered palpably in every empty corner of the apartment. Even as they attempted normalcy, eating breakfast quietly, moving through ordinary routines, the space itself reminded them constantly of what they had forfeited through carelessness. The home felt simultaneously larger and emptier, stripped of the quiet warmth Margaret had nurtured over years of solitude and thoughtful care. It was only later, as Brian helped Amanda fold away the makeshift bedding, that they truly began to understand Margaret's final lesson, that home was not a mere space to occupy, but a sanctuary to honor. Margaret's silent exit spoke louder than any words of anger ever could, leaving the family to reflect on her actions, their disregard, and the quiet power of a woman who, even in departure, had reclaimed her dignity in a way that left them forever changed. Margaret, in leaving quietly, had done what no shouting or confrontation could ever accomplish. She had forced them to hear her at last.